Imagine boarding a plane, settling into your seat, and preparing for an ordinary journey. Now imagine being told in front of everyone that you don't belong there, that your seat paid for, confirmed, and rightfully yours must be given up because of who you appear to be. That's exactly what happened to Jordan Miles, a man who looked like any other passenger, but what no one on that flight knew was that Jordan wasn't just another traveler. He was the CEO of the very airline they were flying. And in that moment, his silence, his composure, and his decision to simply remain in his seat set into motion a chain of events that would shake his company to its core. How would you have reacted if you were in his place? Would you have stayed quiet? Or would you have spoken up? And what happens when the person underestimated the most turns out to hold the greatest power of all? Stay with us, because this story is not just about one seat. It's about dignity, justice, and the courage to change everything. If this already sparks something in you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so we can begin the journey together. The morning sky above Los Angeles shimmered in a pale blue haze, the kind of fragile light that comes just before the sun gathers strength. Outside the vast windows of LAX, airplanes drifted across the runways like silent giants, their tails catching the glow of dawn. The terminal was alive but hushed, a steady murmur of footsteps and rolling luggage punctuated by the occasional boarding call. In the middle of this rhythm stood a man who looked, at first glance, like any other traveler trying to get through another day of transit. His name was Jordan Miles. At 52 years old, he carried himself with the quiet ease of someone who had lived through storms far heavier than airport delays. He wore a navy polo shirt, plain jeans, and sneakers that had lost the shine of newness. His leather carry-on bore the faint scratches of time, the kind that came only from years of use. To most who passed him by, Jordan was invisible, just another passenger in a sea of travelers, and that was precisely the point. Beneath this modest disguise was a man of immense influence, the founder and CEO of Skyreach Airways, one of the fastest-growing airlines in the country. The very planes outside those windows bore his vision. The seats, the service protocols, the slogans painted on every advertisement, all of it had come, at least in part, from his leadership. But today, he did not stand here as a CEO. He stood as a silent witness. For months, troubling reports had reached his desk. Some came in through official complaints, others whispered through anonymous letters, and a few arrived as stories passed on by colleagues who didn't want their names attached. Each one painted a disturbing pattern. Black passengers being asked to show tickets twice, women of color waiting longer for service in business class, guests spoken to with clipped tones as though their very presence was an inconvenience. None of it screamed scandal in isolation, but when placed side by side, the mosaic was undeniable. A culture was forming beneath the glossy branding, and it was a culture that betrayed the values he had sworn his airline would represent. Jordan had wrestled with these accounts for weeks, staring at spreadsheets and performance reviews, asking himself whether he was overreacting. But deep down, he knew numbers never told the whole story. Culture could not be measured by quarterly earnings. Culture lived in moments and glances, in words, in the way a hand either reached out to help or stayed rigid at its side. And so he made his decision. If he wanted the truth, he would have to step into it himself. No entourage, no assistant, no privilege pulled to announce his presence. Just a man with a ticket, walking into the very space his customers walked into every single day. The boarding call echoed across the lounge. Crisp and direct Skyreach Airways Flight 922 to New York, now boarding business class passengers at Gate 12. Jordan took a breath. The kind you take when you know you're stepping across an unseen threshold. His heart carried a mixture of calm discipline and quiet unease. He picked up his leather bag, adjusted it against his shoulder, and began walking toward the gate. The hum of voices around him felt strangely distant, as though the world was giving him space for what lay ahead. At Gate 12, the line for business class was short. A young woman with earbuds scrolled her phone. An older man in a suit shifted impatiently, checking his watch every few seconds. A couple whispered in Spanish, their hands laced together. Jordan took his place among them, expression neutral, his presence unremarkable. When the scanner beeped and his ticket was accepted, he walked down the jet bridge with steady steps. The cool air of the aircraft met him like a second skin, filled with the faint scent of leather and industrial cleaner. The business class cabin stretched before him, sleek and quiet, a carefully curated space of comfort. Jordan found seat 2B and placed his bag overhead with deliberate care. He sat down, exhaling slowly as he adjusted the seat belt. His eyes wandered across the cabin, not with the excitement of a first-time traveler, but with the practiced observation of someone taking notes in his mind. The seats around him were only partly filled. To his left, near the window, sat a middle-aged woman already lost in her Kindle. Across the aisle, a young executive typed furiously on his laptop, earbuds shutting out the world. Behind him, the faint chatter of boarding passengers drifted forward, mingling with the overhead announcements. For a moment, it felt almost ordinary. Almost, but Jordan knew better. He had learned long ago that prejudice rarely arrived with fanfare. It arrived in silence, in side glances, in the subtle shift of tone, and he could already feel, though faintly, the weight of eyes on him as though his presence disrupted an unspoken expectation. He kept his hands folded on his lap, breathing evenly. He had faced situations like this in boardrooms, at conferences, on city streets where strangers assumed they knew his story just by looking at him. But here, in this cabin, his cabin, in a sense, the irony pressed deeper. He was no longer the CEO, he was a test subject in his own experiment. A whisper of anxiety ran through his mind. What if nothing happened? What if the reports were exaggerated, the stories distorted? Would he look foolish for doubting his team? Or worse, what if everything was true, and the culture he had built with such pride was rotting beneath the surface? He closed his eyes briefly, summoning the memory of his father's voice. Power isn't proven in shouting. Son, it's proven in how long you can stand with dignity when someone tries to strip it away. The words steadied him. He opened his notebook, a small brown journal he always carried, and wrote just one line across the blank page, Flight 922. The truth begins today. As the rest of the passengers trickled into the cabin, Jordan leaned back in his seat, outwardly calm, inwardly bracing for what was to come. Somewhere between Los Angeles and New York, the truth of his company would reveal itself. He only hoped he was ready to face it. The boarding process stretched on with its familiar rhythm. Passengers shuffled down the aisle, dragging carry-ons and balancing paper cups of coffee. Jordan Miles sat still in seat 2B, his posture composed, his face unreadable. He let the quiet hum of the cabin surround him, though every sound seemed sharper, every movement more deliberate than usual. He had promised himself he would pay attention to the smallest details, because culture was revealed in moments most people never noticed. The overhead bins closed with a muffled thud. A mother soothed her toddler a few rows back, whispering a lullaby in Spanish. A young man in a tailored blazer claimed the seat across the aisle, immediately pulling out his phone to answer emails. For a brief moment, the cabin looked like a mosaic of ordinary lives, converging for a shared journey across the country. But Jordan's focus shifted when a woman entered from the galley. She was tall, her posture straight as if she carried authority not only in her role but in her bones. Her hair was pulled back into a neat bun, not a strand out of place. The name tag pinned sharply against her crisp uniform read Carla Jensen. She moved with the confidence of someone who believed the cabin belonged to her. As she scanned the rows, her gaze landed on Jordan. It did not soften into a smile. It did not offer welcome. Instead, it lingered with a thin veil of suspicion, as though she were appraising a mistake that had somehow slipped through the boarding gate. Jordan felt the weight of that look, but he did not return it. He had been watched like that before, many times, the eyes that asked questions without words. "Do you belong here? Are you sure this seat is yours?" He leaned back slightly, pretending to adjust the seat belt, steadying his breath. Behind Carla, another crew member entered. She was younger, perhaps in her late 20s, with brown hair tied into a ponytail that swung slightly as she walked. Her steps carried none of Carla's authority, but instead a quiet hesitation, the kind that belonged to someone still learning the fragile balance between rules and compassion. Her name tag read Emily Torres. Emily's eyes flickered briefly toward Jordan. There was no suspicion in them, only curiosity, followed by something softer. She glanced down at the tablet in her hand, checked a detail, then looked away quickly as though afraid of being noticed. Jordan watched the contrast carefully. One woman radiated control laced with distance. The other carried caution, but beneath it a trace of kindness she seemed too nervous to show. He wondered how long it would take before their roles in this story would surface. A moment later, a man entered the cabin with the kind of presence that demanded attention. He was in his mid-50s, tall, with a silver watch that caught the cabin lights. His tailored jacket was unbuttoned, his tie slightly loosened as though to suggest casual comfort that still spoke of wealth. His name, as Jordan would soon overhear, was Richard Cole. Richard paused near Jordan's row, his eyes sliding across him in one deliberate sweep. No greeting, no polite nod, just an expression that hovered between curiosity and dismissal. It was the look of someone measuring another person against his own scale of worth. When Richard moved to his seat a few rows back, Jordan could still feel the residue of that gaze. He had felt it many times before, in lobbies and boardrooms, on sidewalks and at social events. It never needed words. The message was always the same. "You don't fit the picture I expect." Jordan inhaled slowly, grounding himself in silence. He was not here to fight glances. He was here to see whether those glances would turn into something more tangible. The boarding doors closed with a resonant click, sealing the cabin into its own world. A flight attendant gave the safety announcement, her voice practiced and steady. But Jordan's thoughts wandered. He remembered a time in college when he had been invited to a networking event at a downtown hotel. He had arrived in his best suit, carrying resumes carefully tucked into a folder, only to be mistaken for staff by another guest who had asked him to fetch water. The sting of that moment had never fully left him. Now, decades later, as the CEO of an airline, he wondered how many of his passengers felt that same sting every day without him ever seeing it. That was why he was here, to witness, to test, to uncover. Carla moved down the aisle again, offering routine checks. Her eyes landed on Jordan's seat. There was the faintest tightening in her jaw, so quick most would miss it. But Jordan noticed. He prepared himself for what might come next. Emily followed, her hands clutching the tablet as though it were both shield and anchor. When she paused near Jordan's row, she glanced at the screen, hesitated, and then looked up at him. Their eyes met for half a second before she quickly looked away. Pretending to busy herself with another task, that brief look carried something unspoken. She knew he belonged here, but she was not yet ready to say it aloud. The engines hummed, and the plane pushed back from the gate. Jordan shifted slightly, staring out the window. The runway stretched ahead like a promise and a test all at once. He knew the next few hours would reveal not only how the staff treated him, but how the passengers around him responded. Would they watch in silence? Would anyone step forward, or would prejudice be allowed to take root unchecked, hidden behind polite smiles and tight uniforms, as the plane accelerated down the runway? Jordan pressed his hand lightly against his notebook. His father's words echoed in his mind again. True power is tested not when you control the world, but when you allow the world to show its face to you. The aircraft lifted, wheels leaving the earth, climbing into the pale morning sky. A few passengers clapped softly, a ritual that always faded as quickly as it began. Jordan felt the cabin tilt into ascent, the city shrinking below, and he thought to himself that the real journey had only just begun. It would not be long before the questions started. He could sense it in the way Carla's gaze lingered, in the way Richard Cole had smirked, in the way Emily Torres hesitated with her tablet. The first glance had already been cast, the first judgment had already been made. Jordan sat still, his body calm, but inside him a quiet current stirred. He had come looking for the truth. Now he only needed to wait for it to reveal itself. The plane leveled off, the engines humming with steady rhythm as the city disappeared beneath a blanket of soft clouds. The seatbelt sign blinked off, freeing passengers to move, to stretch, to claim the quiet comforts of flight. Jordan Miles adjusted slightly in his seat, resting his elbow on the armrest, watching the cabin settle into its mid-air rhythm. For a moment, everything seemed calm. The woman beside him scrolled through her Kindle. The executive across the aisle typed furiously, and the hum of conversation drifted from rows farther back. But Jordan could feel a tension in the air, faint but undeniable, like static before a storm. He had been in enough boardrooms, enough public spaces, to recognize when something was about to shift. Carla Jensen emerged from the galley, her stride precise, her expression unreadable. She moved with the authority of someone who had long ago decided that her presence commanded the cabin. She paused by Jordan's row, her eyes sweeping him with that same thinly veiled suspicion he had noticed earlier. "Sir," she began, her voice polite on the surface but lined with cold steel. "May I see your boarding pass?" Please, the words landed heavier than they should have. A request, yes, but one wrapped in implication. Jordan glanced up, his face calm, his movements unhurried. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the neatly folded ticket, and handed it to her without speaking. Carla unfolded it with deliberate slowness, as if expecting to find some error hidden within the ink. Her eyes scanned the details, her lips pressed into a firm line. She gave the faintest nod, but it was not a nod of acceptance. It was a nod that said the information on the page had not fully convinced her. "Oh," she said lightly, though her tone carried no warmth. "That is unusual. This seat is reserved for our most privileged passengers. If you like, I can help you find a more suitable seat in economy." Her voice lifted just enough for nearby passengers to hear. Heads turned. Curious eyes flickered toward Jordan. Some wore expressions of quiet interest, others of faint amusement. A man across the aisle smirked as though the moment confirmed his expectations. Jordan held her gaze for a brief moment, then inhaled slowly. His heartbeat remained steady, but inside he felt the stir of old memories of being told as a young man that certain doors were not meant for him, memories of walking into meetings where people assumed he was there to serve, not to lead. He let those memories pass through him like echoes, then placed them aside. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and quiet. "I will remain in my assigned seat." Carla's eyes flickered, but only for a second. Her professional mask returned as she folded the ticket and handed it back. Without another word, she turned sharply and walked down the aisle, her shoulders stiff. Jordan slipped the ticket back into his pocket, his expression unchanged. He could feel the shift in the cabin, though, subtle but real. Conversations dipped lower. Eyes lingered a little longer. In the corner of his vision, he saw Richard Cole leaning back in his seat, his mouth curved into the faint smile of a man who believed the order of things had been confirmed. Jordan reached for his phone, tilting it slightly to shield the screen. With practiced ease, he typed a brief message to the operations team. Code Silver, Flight 922, immediate, Gate 12. The words were short, precise, the kind of language designed to trigger protocol without drawing attention. He set the phone face down on his tray table, his fingers resting lightly on it. He did not feel anger, not exactly. What he felt was anticipation, the kind of steady focus that came when the veil of appearances was beginning to lift. Emily Torres appeared a few minutes later, tablet in hand. She hesitated near his row, her eyes flicking from the screen to his face. For a moment, she seemed caught between duty and fear, as though speaking the truth might cost her more than silence ever could. Finally, she leaned in slightly, her voice low. "Sir," she whispered, "your ticket is fully valid. Seat 2B is correctly assigned and paid." Jordan looked at her, his expression softening just enough to convey gratitude. "I know," he replied quietly. "Thank you." Her shoulders eased a fraction. She nodded, then stepped back, retreating toward the galley as if she had said something dangerous. Jordan watched her go, admiring the quiet courage it had taken to confirm what she already knew. Integrity rarely announced itself with grand speeches. More often, it whispered in the voices of people like Emily, people who chose truth in the smallest of ways. But the fragile calm did not last long. Richard Cole, sitting just a few rows back, suddenly leaned forward, his voice sharp and loud enough for the cabin to hear. "Maybe next time," he said, his words dripping with condescension. "People like you should choose seats that are appropriate instead of causing trouble." The remark sliced through the air like a blade. Several passengers stiffened. A few turned their heads quickly as though the sound had burned them. Some frowned subtly, while others pretended to be lost in their phones or out the window. The silence that followed was not absence of sound, but a heavy weight pressing into every corner of the cabin. Jordan remained still, his hands resting on his thighs, his gaze forward. He had endured moments like this before, moments where one outburst could ignite the room, where one wrong word could turn the tide against him. His silence was not surrender, but strategy. He reached once more for his phone, opening the security app, and with a few swift taps sent another alert. Code Silver confirmed. Immediate response requested. He placed the phone back down, his breath steady. He knew that within minutes, headquarters would react, executives would leave their meetings, phones would light up, and the machinery of accountability would begin to move. But here, in this cabin, Jordan remained nothing more than another passenger. That was the point. He wanted to see who would speak, who would stay silent, and who would choose to wield authority like a weapon. Around him, the atmosphere thickened, a silence that carried tension rather than peace. He glanced sideways and saw the woman at the window beside him pressing her lips together, her eyes flickering toward him with sympathy, but no words. Across the aisle, the young executive had slowed his typing, his fingers hovering above the keys as though he too felt the weight of the moment, but was unwilling to enter it. Jordan sat taller, his posture unbroken. He had chosen this path, chosen to walk into the heart of discomfort, because only in discomfort did truth reveal itself. The storm had arrived, not with turbulence from the skies, but with turbulence from human hearts, and Jordan, calm and steady, would ride it until every hidden current was exposed. The engines droned steadily, carrying the plane eastward through a pale morning sky. From the outside, the aircraft was just another steel bird in flight, but inside the business-class cabin tension simmered just beneath the surface. Jordan Miles sat in seat 2B, his back straight, his breathing calm, yet every sense sharpened. He could feel the atmosphere shifting, small ripples spreading from one interaction, one remark, one suspicious glance. Carla Jensen returned from the galley, her expression still composed, but there was a rigidness to her walk now. Authority clung to her like armor. She stopped near Jordan's row once more, her gaze fixed on him with the same cold suspicion. "Sir," she said, her voice clipped, "I've checked our roster again. There must be some error. This seat is generally reserved for our premium clientele. I can arrange a comfortable seat for you in economy." Her words were polite enough, but they carried the sting of exclusion. She wanted him gone, and she wanted the other passengers to hear it too. Her tone carried easily across the quiet cabin, ensuring that no one missed the subtle accusation. Jordan did not look up immediately. He let a beat of silence hang in the air, 1 second, then 2, before raising his eyes to meet hers. His voice was calm, steady, the voice of someone who had carried weight heavier than this moment. "My ticket is valid," he said softly. "I will remain in this seat." The firmness in his tone drew eyes from around the cabin. Passengers shifted slightly in their seats, pretending not to watch while watching intently. A businessman in the third row lifted his coffee cup to his lips but never drank, his eyes locked on the confrontation. A woman across the aisle lowered her magazine, feigning casual interest. Carla's lips tightened, the faintest flicker of frustration betraying her otherwise professional mask. She leaned slightly closer, her voice dropping but not enough to hide from nearby ears. "Please, sir, Don't make this more difficult than it has to be." Jordan's heartbeat remained steady, but his thoughts churned. He could feel the old wounds stirring inside him, the memory of being told as a young man that he was in the wrong place, that he should move along quietly for everyone's comfort. He remembered being turned away from restaurants, being followed in stores, being asked to prove again and again that he belonged. The years had tempered his response, but the sting had never fully faded. He inhaled deeply, allowing the calm to wash over him. He was not that young man anymore. He was stronger now, steadier, and with more at stake. "I'm not making anything difficult," he replied, still measured, still even. "I'm sitting in the seat I paid for. That is all." A hush rippled across the rows, the silence louder than any argument. The conflict was no longer private. It was now a spectacle, a stage set before unwilling witnesses. And on that stage, every gesture, every word would linger in memory. Carla hesitated, caught in the tension between pushing harder and stepping back. But before she could decide, Richard Cole's voice rang out from a few rows behind, sharp and cutting. "Honestly, this is ridiculous," Richard declared, his tone dripping with disdain. "Some people just can't accept when they're out of place. You're holding up everyone else with this nonsense." A few passengers winced. Others looked down at their laps. No one spoke in defense. The silence of the cabin became complicit, each unspoken word a quiet choice. Jordan sat still, his hands folded neatly, his face calm. But inside, a storm churned. He felt the old anger rise, the urge to stand and let his authority crash through the cabin like thunder. Yet he knew better. Power revealed in rage could be dismissed. Power revealed in patience could not be ignored. His mind replayed his father's words again. "Dignity is not in the noise, but in the stillness you refuse to surrender." He turned his gaze forward, ignoring Richard entirely. Then, without a word, he picked up his phone once more and opened the secured application. His fingers moved quickly, entering the code with precision. Code Silver confirmed. Cabin 2B. Escalating. The message sent. He set the phone down again, his face a mask of composure. He would let the system respond. He would let the truth reveal itself. Carla straightened, clearly unsettled by his refusal to yield. She forced a smile toward another passenger, then retreated toward the galley. The air around her seemed heavier, her shoulders tense. She knew eyes had witnessed the exchange. She knew the line between professionalism and prejudice had been crossed, however quietly. Jordan leaned back slightly, not in comfort but in declaration. He was here. He was not moving, and no amount of subtle pressure would change that. Around him, passengers shifted in their own silent ways. A woman across the aisle gave him the faintest nod. A flicker of support she quickly hid by returning to her book. A man, 2 rows back, muttered something under his breath but kept his eyes down. The cabin had become a theater, every person an actor playing out roles of courage, silence, or complicity. Jordan let his eyes drift to the window, to the endless sky stretched beyond. He wondered how many times moments like this had played out unseen. How many passengers had been made to feel unwelcome without anyone to witness or to hold the line. That thought steeled his resolve. This was not just about him. This was about everyone who had ever been asked to prove they belonged when their ticket should have been proof enough. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one heavy with anticipation. He knew the next phase was already in motion. The operations team had received his alerts. Executives would be making calls, procedures would shift, change was on its way. But here, in this cabin, the test continued. Who would step forward? Who would remain silent, and who would reveal themselves in the moments that mattered most? Jordan folded his hands over his notebook, staring at the blank page as though it were a mirror. The words he would write later would matter. But for now, silence spoke louder than ink. The spark had been struck. The fire had only just begun. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft reached its cruising altitude. The soft chime overhead announced the beginning of service. But the mood inside the business class cabin had already shifted. It was no longer simply a space of quiet comfort. It had become charged, tense, filled with an invisible current running between glances and silences. Jordan Miles sat perfectly still. His notebook closed on the tray in front of him. His expression betrayed nothing. But his senses were sharpened to every movement. He could feel the weight of eyes on him, some curious, some sympathetic, others tinged with quiet judgment. The confrontation with Carla Jensen had ended for the moment. But the echo of her words still lingered in the air like smoke refusing to clear. From a few rows back came a voice that cut through the silence with deliberate sharpness. Richard Cole leaned forward, his tone loud enough to command the cabin. "You know, it's really not that complicated," he said, his words wrapped in false casualness but edged with cruelty. "If people respected the order of things, we wouldn't be having this disruption. Seats like these aren't meant for just anyone. They're meant for those who've earned them." The remark landed like a stone dropped in still water. The ripple spread instantly. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, some lowering their eyes, others pretending to focus on screens or books. A few glanced toward Jordan quickly, then away, unwilling to linger. Jordan felt the sting of the words, but he had expected them. He kept his hands folded neatly in his lap, his breathing calm. He had lived through such statements before. Each one cloaked in entitlement. Each one meant to remind him that belonging was not assumed, that acceptance had to be proved again and again. Emily Torres appeared then, moving cautiously down the aisle with her service cart. Her eyes flickered nervously toward Jordan, then toward Richard, then back to the screen of her tablet. She paused at Jordan's row, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" she asked. Jordan looked up at her. For a moment, their eyes met, and in hers he saw the struggle, the desire to do her job fairly, the fear of stepping outside the unspoken rules, the tension of choosing between silence and courage. "Water, room temperature," Jordan said softly. She nodded, poured the glass, and set it gently on his tray. As she did, she leaned just slightly closer, her voice so low only he could hear. "I checked again," she whispered. "Your seat is perfectly valid. There's no mistake." Jordan inclined his head in gratitude, his voice equally soft. "I know, and I appreciate you telling me." The moment lasted only seconds, but it carried weight. Integrity did not always arrive in bold declarations. Sometimes it arrived in whispers, in the quiet courage of one person willing to confirm what was true when others chose doubt. As Emily moved on, Richard scoffed loudly enough for everyone to hear. Figures. Always someone bending the rules. Next thing you know, they'll be handing out first-class seats for sympathy. A flush of discomfort passed across the cabin. A woman near the window shifted in her seat, visibly unsettled. The businessman across the aisle cleared his throat but said nothing. The silence of the witnesses thickened, each moment of inaction adding to the weight pressing down on Jordan. Inside, Jordan felt the familiar battle rising. Part of him wanted to stand, to let his voice cut through the air with authority, to put Richard in his place with words sharp enough to silence him. But another part of him, the stronger part, reminded him of his purpose. He was not here to defend his pride. He was here to see the truth of the culture he had built, to see how his staff, his passengers, his system responded when the mask was stripped away. He closed his eyes briefly, grounding himself in his father's voice again. Patience is not weakness. Patience is strength controlled. When he opened his eyes, he lifted the glass of water, took a slow sip, and set it back down with deliberate calm. His silence became its own statement. He would not be baited into noise. Carla reappeared from the galley, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. She glanced at Richard, then at Jordan, then quickly away. For a moment, Jordan wondered if she had heard Richard's remark and chosen to ignore it, or if she had silently approved. Either way, her absence of action spoke volumes. The cabin grew heavier, the unspoken dividing lines clear. There were those who aligned with Richard, those who shrank into silence, and the few like Emily whose small acts of truth pierced the tension. Jordan rested his hand lightly on his notebook, resisting the urge to write. He wanted to capture the details, the words, the expressions, the silences, but for now, live in the moment mattered more than recording it. He glanced toward the window, the endless sky stretching beyond, somewhere below. Cities and towns bustled with lives unaware of the drama unfolding in this small capsule of air. And yet, he knew. Stories like this played out every day. Not always on airplanes, not always in public, but always in ways that reminded some people that their place was questioned. Richard leaned back in his seat, satisfied with his performance. He wore the smirk of a man who believed he had said what others were thinking, but too polite to speak aloud. His entitlement sat on him like a tailored suit, polished but empty of grace. Jordan let the silence linger. He had chosen this path, and he would see it through. He knew help was already moving behind the scenes. He had sent the code, executives would respond, the system would shift. But, for now, the test remained, and he would hold his seat, steady and unyielding, until every truth revealed itself. The business-class cabin had become more than a section of an airplane. It had become a mirror, reflecting the choices of everyone inside. Some chose prejudice, some chose silence, and a few chose courage. Jordan knew that what he witnessed here would guide the changes to come. He leaned back, closed his eyes for a moment, and breathed deeply. The words of his father echoed once more, steady and true. Respect is not given. Respect is lived, even when no one else offers it. Jordan opened his eyes, his resolve unbroken. The voices of prejudice had spoken. Now he would wait to see whose voices would rise next. The cabin lights glowed softly as attendants moved through the aisles with trays of drinks. The hum of the engines was steady, but beneath that calm rhythm, tension lingered like a storm cloud that refused to pass. Jordan Miles sat in seat 2B, outwardly still, inwardly wrestling with the echoes of words spoken minutes earlier. Richard Cole's smug voice replayed in his memory, each syllable dripping with disdain. Carla's subtle insistence that he did not belong echoed just as sharply. Jordan clasped his hands together, resting them on his lap, and let his gaze drift toward the window. Clouds stretched endlessly below, white fields broken only by shadows where the sun could not reach. The view was peaceful, almost deceptive. Outside, the world looked weightless. Inside, the weight pressed hard against his chest. Silence can be a heavy thing. It is not merely the absence of words. It is a presence, an invisible wall pressing down on everyone in its reach. Jordan could feel it pressing now. The passengers who heard Richard's remarks had chosen silence. The crew who witnessed Carla's behavior had chosen silence. And even he, for now, sat in silence. Inside him, two voices battled. One was the voice of pride, demanding that he rise, speak, and claim his place with thunder. The other was the voice of discipline, reminding him of his purpose. He was not here to win an argument. He was here to see what his company's culture looked like when no one knew who he was. Still, the struggle weighed on him. He remembered the first time he faced words like Richard's. He had been 17, standing in line at a department store. A man behind him had muttered something sharp and ugly, questioning why a kid like him was wasting time in a line meant for customers buying suits. Jordan had frozen then, too young to know what to say, too proud to walk away. That moment carved something into him. It was not just the insult. It was the silence of those around him. No one had spoken. No one had defended him. And here he was, decades later, living the same silence in a cabin 30,000 feet above the ground. He breathed deeply, centering himself, drawing strength from memory instead of letting it crush him. His father's voice rose once again in his mind. Patience is not surrender. It is the decision to fight on ground you choose, not ground chosen for you. Jordan opened his eyes, scanning the cabin. The woman beside him glanced sideways, her lips pressing together as if she wanted to speak but could not. Across the aisle, the young executive had stopped typing. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, his eyes fixed on his screen but unfocused, betraying the weight of what he had overheard. Emily Torres reappeared, walking carefully with her tray. Her eyes flickered toward Jordan, then quickly away. She had already taken a risk by whispering to him. He could see her hesitation now, caught between the safety of neutrality and the cost of integrity. Her silence, though understandable, added to the chorus of unspoken complicity. Jordan tilted his head slightly, watching her disappear back toward the galley. He did not judge her. He knew the weight she carried. For someone in her position, speaking up too loudly might have cost her job. He respected her courage even in the small ways she had chosen to show it, but Richard's voice still lingered. The arrogance, the entitlement, the cruel certainty that he was voicing what others secretly believed. Jordan could feel the anger stir within him again, rising like a tide against the shore of his composure. For a moment, he imagined standing. He imagined turning toward Richard, his voice booming with authority, every eye in the cabin fixed on him. He imagined stripping away the smugness with the truth of who he really was, the CEO, the man who owned the very seat Richard believed he did not deserve. But he remained still. Anger would have given Richard exactly what he wanted. Anger would have shifted the narrative. The story would no longer be about the prejudice displayed against him. It would become about his reaction, his disruption, his temper. He refused to give Richard that victory. So he let silence hold, not because he was weak, but because he understood its power. His silence was not absence. It was resistance. It was a refusal to surrender dignity in exchange for noise. He reached for his notebook and opened to a blank page. With steady handwriting, he began to record the details: Carla's tone, Richard's remarks, the passenger's silence, Emily's whisper. Each note was a thread in a larger pattern he was determined to unravel. As his pen moved, he felt the tension in his chest ease slightly. Writing gave form to the weight, turned it into something he could hold and examine rather than something pressing invisibly against him. He paused, tapping the pen lightly against the page, then wrote one sentence alone, centered in the middle. Silence reveals more than words ever could. He closed the notebook and set it aside. The aircraft hummed onward, slicing through the sky. The cabin looked ordinary again, attendants serving drinks, passengers flipping through magazines, the occasional cough or rustle of a page. But Jordan knew better. Nothing about this flight was ordinary anymore. He leaned back, folding his arms loosely across his chest. His thoughts turned toward the future. If this was what he experienced as a hidden observer, what did that mean for the thousands of passengers who flew Skyreach every day? How many of them walked away carrying the sting of moments like this? How many carried wounds no one in leadership ever saw? The thought tightened his resolve. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing heavier than the silence. This was his airline, his culture, his people. And if this was the truth of what they had become, then change was not optional. It was urgent. Jordan shifted slightly, glancing toward the galley where Carla stood speaking with another crew member. Her voice was low, her posture rigid. He could not hear her words, but he could read the stiffness in her shoulders. She was unsettled. She knew the line she had crossed, whether she admitted it aloud or not. Richard, meanwhile, leaned back in his seat with the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he had already won. His arms were crossed, his expression relaxed, his body language radiating entitlement. Jordan turned back toward the window. The sky stretched endlessly, clouds glowing beneath the sun. In that quiet expanse, he found clarity. His silence was not weakness. It was preparation. He was letting the story unfold. He was letting every choice, every word, every silence speak for itself. Because soon, the silence would break. And when it did, truth would pour out like a flood. The hum of the engines had settled into a steady rhythm, a sound so constant it almost faded into silence. But for Jordan Miles, sitting in 2B, every second carried weight. The notebook on his tray remained closed, its cover pressed under his palm as though anchoring him to purpose. He had chosen patience, had chosen silence, but he also knew his signal had already set wheels into motion, somewhere below, at headquarters and in the airport's operations center. His alerts had been received. He imagined the sudden flurry of phone calls, the brisk steps of executives leaving their meetings, the whispers of urgency traveling through corridors. The system was stirring, still here in the cabin. Time moved slowly. The passengers had returned to their routines, though the atmosphere remained taut. Conversations were hushed, gestures careful. Richard Cole leaned back in his seat, a look of smug satisfaction still carved across his face. Carla Jensen moved about her duties with rigid precision, her posture strained, her eyes occasionally flicking toward Jordan, but never lingering too long. Jordan remained still. He could feel the current building beneath the surface. He knew it would only be a matter of time before it broke through. It came in the form of a quiet disruption. From the front of the cabin, the intercom chimed, 3 distinct tones that cut through the background hum. A few passengers glanced up in surprise. Carla froze mid-step, her shoulders stiffening. Emily Torres answered the call at the galley. She listened intently, nodding once, her face a mixture of nervousness and relief. She placed the receiver down, then walked quickly toward Carla. Her voice was low but urgent. "The captain would like to see you in the cockpit," she said. Carla's eyes narrowed. "Now, yes, immediately." The brief exchange carried more weight than the words themselves. Passengers shifted in their seats, sensing something unusual. Carla hesitated, then straightened her shoulders and walked briskly toward the front. The cockpit door closed behind her with a muted click. Jordan exhaled quietly, his composure unbroken, though inside he felt the stirrings of anticipation. The shift had begun. Moments later, movement at the aircraft door caught his eye. A tall man in a dark navy suit stepped into the cabin, flanked by two uniformed airport managers. His stride was calm yet deliberate, the kind of stride that carried authority without needing to demand it. His name was Marcus Green, Vice President of External Affairs for Skyreach Airways. Jordan recognized him immediately, though Marcus gave no sign of recognition in return. To the passengers, Marcus was just another executive summoned for an unspecified matter. To Jordan, he was a trusted lieutenant, one of the few people in leadership who understood the delicate balance between authority and empathy. The atmosphere shifted the moment Marcus entered. Conversations quieted. Passengers leaned back in their seats, curiosity and tension mingling in their expressions. Even Richard Cole's smirk faltered slightly, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Marcus scanned the cabin with measured calm. His eyes landed briefly on Jordan, and in that fraction of a second, an unspoken understanding passed between them. Marcus gave the slightest nod, then turned his attention outward. "Ladies and gentlemen," one of the airport managers announced firmly, "we apologize for the brief delay. We need to address an internal matter before continuing service. We appreciate your patience." The vague statement carried weight. Passengers exchanged glances. Whispers rippled quietly through the rows. The tension shifted again, from silent prejudice to collective curiosity. Something was happening, though no one yet knew what. Marcus walked toward Jordan's row. He did not crouch, did not extend his hand, did not break the illusion of anonymity. He simply stood beside the seat, his voice low enough for only Jordan to hear. "I came as quickly as I could," Marcus said. "We'll handle this discreetly." Jordan nodded once, his face composed. "Good. I want to observe a little longer. Let the reactions play out." Marcus inclined his head in agreement, then stepped back. His presence alone was enough to alter the air. The power Carla had wielded with suspicion dissolved the moment he arrived, even without speaking directly. Marcus had drawn the line. The situation was no longer under her control. From the corner of his eye, Jordan noticed Emily watching. Her expression was a mix of relief and uncertainty, as though silently grateful that someone with authority had finally stepped into the scene. Richard, however, shifted uneasily in his seat. He tried to mask it with a scoff, muttering something under his breath, but his confidence had faltered. Authority had entered the cabin, and with it, the certainty of impunity had cracked. Jordan sat straighter, his calm unshaken. He had wanted to see the truth, and the truth had revealed itself. Carla's suspicion, Richard's prejudice, the passenger's silence, Emily's quiet integrity, and now Marcus's intervention. Each piece was falling into place, building the mosaic of a culture in desperate need of change. The aircraft continued its steady path through the sky, but inside the business-class cabin, nothing felt steady anymore. The balance of power had shifted, and with it, the stage was set for what would come next. Jordan rested his hand once more on his notebook. He had not written since the last page, but, in his mind, the next line was already forming. Authority, when wielded without justice, becomes oppression. Authority, when wielded with integrity, restores balance. The silence in the cabin was no longer the silence of complicity. It was the silence of anticipation. Something was about to change, and everyone could feel it. Jordan leaned back, his expression calm, his body language composed. He knew the next act of this unfolding drama would demand clarity, courage, and decisive action. And when the moment came, he would be ready. The cabin was suspended in an uneasy calm. Marcus Green's arrival had shifted the atmosphere, pulling the weight of authority away from Carla Jensen and settling it firmly at the front of the business class section. Yet the silence persisted, a silence filled with watching eyes, unspoken judgments, and the quiet discomfort of passengers who sensed they were witnessing something they would remember long after the flight was over. Jordan Miles sat still in seat 2B, his gaze fixed ahead, his demeanor calm. Inside, however, the storm continued to churn. The silence of the passengers weighed heavily on him. He knew why they stayed quiet: fear of embarrassment, fear of confrontation, fear of stepping into conflict that was not their own. But silence, he also knew, was never neutral. It always sided with the one who had spoken first, the one who had dared to turn prejudice into words. Richard Cole leaned back smugly, his arms crossed, his smirk returning now that Carla was gone from view. He seemed to take Marcus's presence not as a threat, but as confirmation that his complaints had weight. He muttered something about order and standards, just loud enough for a few rows to hear. Jordan caught the murmurs but did not respond. His choice to remain silent was deliberate, but he wondered how much longer silence could last before it either broke under pressure or was pierced by courage. It happened more quietly than he expected. Across the aisle, a woman in her early 50s leaned slightly forward. She had been silent until now, her face thoughtful, her eyes steady. Her name, as Jordan would later learn, was Linda Park. She was Asian American, dressed in a simple navy blouse and slacks, her manner professional yet warm. She turned her gaze toward Jordan, then spoke clearly enough for the surrounding rows to hear. "I just want to say," Linda began, her voice calm but firm, "that no one should be treated the way you were treated earlier. Not here. Not anywhere." The words cut through the silence like a blade through cloth. Heads turned. Passengers who had been pretending to read, to type, to sleep, now looked up. Richard's smirk faltered. Emily, standing near the galley, froze in place, her eyes wide with surprise. Jordan turned his head slightly, meeting Linda's eyes. There was no pity there, no hesitation, only conviction. Her words were not dramatic, not raised in anger, but they carried a weight that shifted the balance of the room. From a few rows back, a man in a gray suit spoke up, his voice quieter but supportive. "Indeed," he said, "the way you handled all of this was admirable, calm, steady. Not many could do that." A ripple moved through the cabin. A few passengers nodded subtly, others exchanged glances. The silence once heavy and complicit, began to crack. Embarrassment flickered across faces, embarrassment not only at what had been said by Richard, but at their own choice to remain silent for so long. Jordan inclined his head slightly toward Linda. His words were measured, soft. "Thank you." Sometimes a single voice makes all the difference. Linda held his gaze for a moment, then sat back, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her action was simple, but it was enough. By choosing to speak, she had broken the dam. What had been one man's prejudice and an entire cabin's silence was now transformed into a conversation, a reckoning of conscience. Richard bristled. He shifted in his seat, his voice sharp. "I don't see why everyone's making such a big deal out of this. I only said what others were thinking. Standards are standards." But his words no longer carried the same force. The silence no longer belonged to him. The cabin's mood had shifted, and his entitlement now looked smaller, weaker, in the light of Linda's courage. Jordan felt something loosen in his chest. The struggle within him eased slightly. For the first time since the confrontation began, he did not feel alone. Linda's voice had carried more than support. It had carried proof that compassion and justice still found their way into spaces where silence too often ruled. He reached once more for his notebook, opening it slowly. His pen moved across the page, steady and deliberate. He wrote, "When silence breaks, truth enters. One voice can unravel the weight of prejudice." He closed the notebook again, satisfied that the moment had been recorded, not just in ink, but in memory. Marcus Green, standing near the aisle, observed quietly. He had said nothing yet, but Jordan could see in his eyes that he understood the importance of what had just happened. Authority could shift structures, but voices from within the crowd, that was where change took root. Emily Torres passed once more, her hands lightly brushing the edge of her tray as she moved. As she leaned closer to Jordan's row, she whispered quickly, her voice tinged with relief. "I'm glad someone spoke up." Jordan gave her a small nod. "So am I." The aircraft continued its steady course eastward, but inside the cabin the air was lighter now, though still charged. Tension remained, but it was no longer the suffocating weight of silence. It was the tension of awakening, of people realizing they had been complicit and quietly questioning what they would do next time. Jordan sat back in his seat, resting his head against the cushion. He allowed himself a small smile, barely perceptible. This was what he had hoped to see, not only prejudice exposed, but also courage revealed and silence broken. The rest of the flight stretched ahead, and he knew more tests would come. Carla would return. Richard would not let go so easily. But now he felt steadier. He was no longer the only one holding the line. He closed his eyes briefly, hearing his father's voice once more. Dignity is not only what you hold for yourself, it is what you inspire in others. When he opened them again, he looked once more at Linda Park. She met his gaze across the aisle, offering a simple, quiet nod. And in that nod lay a truth that no amount of prejudice could erase. The plane flew steady, cutting through the pale afternoon sky. Inside the business class cabin, the silence had shifted once again. No longer was it a silence of complicity. Thanks to Linda Park's words, it had become the silence of reflection. People were asking themselves questions they had avoided moments earlier. Why had they not spoken sooner? Why had it taken just one voice to pierce the fog? Jordan Miles could feel the change in the air. The weight pressing against him had lightened. if only slightly. He sat composed, his hands folded on the armrest, his gaze fixed forward, but he remained alert, sensing that the conflict was far from over. Richard Cole shifted in his seat, visibly unsettled. The smirk that had once seemed etched into his features was now forced. His arrogance cracked. He muttered to himself, words only he could hear, as though trying to rebuild the wall that Linda's courage had torn down. Jordan turned his eyes toward the front of the cabin. The cockpit door opened with a sharp click, and Captain Andrew Hayes stepped out. He was stocky, in his late 40s, with a calm presence that carried the weight of command. His uniform was neat, his stride measured, his eyes scanning the cabin with deliberate care. Passengers straightened unconsciously. The presence of a captain always carried gravity. Whatever this was, it had escalated enough to bring the highest authority on the aircraft out of the cockpit. That fact alone shifted the atmosphere. Hayes moved to the small service area near the front, just a few feet from Jordan's row. His voice was low but firm as he addressed Marcus Green. "I need a private word with the passenger in 2B. Marcus nodded, then leaned slightly toward Jordan. "The captain would like to see you." Jordan rose slowly, his movements calm. He followed Hayes into the narrow space between the cockpit and the business-class cabin. The hum of the engines filled the background, but here the air was tighter, heavier. Hayes turned to face him. His voice was respectful, but there was an edge of concern. "Sir, I need to understand what happened. I've been informed there was a dispute regarding your seat." Jordan met his gaze evenly. His voice was calm, steady, but every word carried weight. "I was asked to leave my seat. I was told it was reserved for someone more privileged. When I refused, another passenger chose to humiliate me publicly. This is not an isolated incident. It is part of a pattern I've seen reported before, and I need to know why." Hayes hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. He could see this was no ordinary complaint. The composure, the clarity, the authority in Jordan's tone, this was a man accustomed to leadership, not someone easily dismissed. "I will prepare a full report," Hayes said finally. "I'll document every detail and forward it directly to internal review. There will be no cover-up." Jordan studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good. Remember this, Captain. Loyalty without responsibility is only an excuse to hide wrongdoing. I am not asking for apologies. I am asking for clarity, and I expect it." Hayes inclined his head, the weight of the words settling on him. Understood. The exchange was brief, but its significance was unmistakable. When Hayes returned to the cockpit, the cabin would no longer see Jordan as a man quietly sitting in 2B. They would see him as someone the captain himself had consulted with directly. That alone would shift the perception of power. Jordan returned to his seat, his steps unhurried, his posture steady. Passengers watched him with new eyes, whispers beginning to ripple once more. Richard Cole looked up, his smugness faltering further. For the first time, uncertainty etched itself clearly across his face. Emily Torres appeared again, holding a tray of glasses. Her movements were slower now, deliberate, as though she understood the gravity of every step. She placed a glass of water on Jordan's tray without a word, but the look in her eyes carried volumes: gratitude, respect, quiet solidarity. Jordan lifted the glass, sipped once, and set it down. His silence was once again deliberate, but its meaning had changed. It was no longer silence forced upon him by prejudice. It was silence chosen, silence that spoke louder than words. Minutes later, Carla Jensen returned from the cockpit. Her face was pale, her shoulders tense. She avoided eye contact with Jordan completely, moving quickly to the galley. Whatever words had been spoken behind that closed door had left their mark. Linda Park glanced across the aisle, her eyes meeting Jordan's briefly. She gave him a small nod, as if to say, "It's working." Jordan rested his hand on his notebook again. He opened it and wrote, "The captain has seen. Authority has been tested. Now comes accountability." The aircraft hummed onward, its steady flight belying the turbulence within the cabin. A drama had unfolded here, one that no passenger would easily forget. Jordan leaned back, exhaling slowly. He knew this was still only the beginning. The true reckoning would come after landing, when actions would replace words. But here, mid-air, the truth was already undeniable. The system had been exposed, and with exposure came the demand for change. He closed his eyes briefly, hearing his father's words echo once more. True leadership is not about avoiding conflict. It is about walking into it, calm and unflinching, and showing others what courage looks like. When he opened his eyes, he was ready for what came next. The aircraft sailed smoothly above the clouds, its engines humming in steady rhythm, but inside the business-class cabin, the atmosphere had shifted once more. It was no longer only tension or silence. It had become awareness, the kind of collective recognition that what was happening was not ordinary. Passengers glanced at one another with eyes wide and cautious, the way people look when they realize they are inside a story they will later tell. Jordan Miles remained in seat 2B, his posture calm, his gaze forward. The private exchange with Captain Andrew Hayes replayed in his mind, not because he doubted the words, but because of their weight. The captain had promised accountability. He had promised no cover-up. In Jordan's experience, those promises were rarely made so directly. That alone marked the moment as historic. Across the cabin, Carla Jensen returned from the cockpit. Her face was pale, the confident composure she had once carried replaced by something brittle. She avoided Jordan entirely, her eyes scanning over passengers without settling anywhere. The crisp authority of her steps was gone. Instead, she moved quickly, almost defensively, as though the very air around her had turned hostile. Passengers noticed. They whispered quietly, their glances sharp. Some leaned toward one another, murmuring questions they did not dare speak aloud. Others simply watched, their silence filled with judgment. Richard Cole shifted uneasily. His earlier arrogance had crumbled into something less certain. He adjusted his jacket, crossed and uncrossed his arms, and cleared his throat loudly as if to remind the cabin of his presence. Yet the weight of authority had moved elsewhere, and he no longer held the power he once believed he did. Emily Torres emerged from the galley, her steps careful but steady. She carried herself differently now, her back straighter, her eyes clearer. Though she said nothing aloud, her presence alone carried a quiet statement. She was not complicit. She was not aligned with Carla. She was choosing her ground carefully, and passengers noticed that too. Linda Park sat across the aisle, her gaze calm, her hands folded in her lap. When her eyes met Jordan's, she offered a subtle nod again, a silent reminder that he was not alone, that one act, so simple, carried more weight than any speech. Jordan felt the ripple of realization moving through the cabin. People were waking up, What had begun as prejudice wrapped in politeness had become a public unraveling of authority, and now every person in the cabin was faced with the same question: what side of this story would they stand on? He opened his notebook once more, his pen moving in steady strokes. He wrote, "Leadership is not only tested in the boardroom, it is tested here, in the spaces where silence has ruled too long." The words calmed him, but they also sharpened his resolve. He was not here to merely endure. He was here to bear witness, to collect the truth with his own eyes, to see who would falter and who would stand. Carla's voice broke the hum of the engines. She stood near the front, speaking quietly with another attendant, but the tightness of her tone carried into the rows. Fragments of words drifted back: procedures, misunderstanding, report. Passengers leaned subtly closer, straining to catch what was being said. Jordan watched her carefully. Her facade was cracking. The confidence she had once wielded like a weapon was now fragile. The captain had summoned her. Authority had arrived in the form of Marcus Green, and passengers had begun to speak. Each moment had chipped away at her control. Now, she looked like someone standing on a crumbling ledge, still clinging but unable to hold on much longer. Richard finally broke the tension with a sharp remark. "All of this for one seat. Ridiculous. You'd think the world was ending." But his words fell flat. No nods of agreement followed. No murmurs of support rose from the rows. Instead, a heavy quiet followed. The kind of quiet that reveals isolation. For the first time, Richard seemed smaller, a man shouting into an echo chamber of his own making. Jordan kept his composure, but inwardly he recognized the shift. The crowd had turned. Not openly, not loudly, but in the quiet ways that matter most. Silence that had once sided with prejudice was now silence of disapproval. Emily walked past Richard's row, her steps measured. For a fleeting moment, her eyes flicked toward him, not with fear, but with disapproval. That glance alone was enough to unravel what little smugness he had left. He looked away, his jaw tightening. The aircraft felt different now. Authority had stepped in, prejudice had been exposed, and silence had been broken. The facade of control that Carla and Richard once held had cracked wide open, and in its place, something stronger was taking root, a collective awareness that dignity mattered, that truth mattered, that every gesture mattered. Jordan leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. He remembered again the countless stories he had read in reports, passengers describing moments of humiliation that had gone unanswered. He remembered the frustration of knowing those stories were often dismissed as isolated incidents. Now he had lived it himself, and there was no denying the truth. When he opened his eyes, he felt the weight of the moment settle deeper. This was no longer about one seat, one flight, one confrontation. It was about the soul of his airline, and, by extension, it was about every place where silence had allowed prejudice to fester unchecked. He lifted his pen again and wrote a single line at the bottom of the page. "The cracks in the facade are the beginning of change." Closing the notebook, he looked once more across the aisle. Linda Park met his gaze again, her quiet strength steady. Emily, standing near the galley, glanced back at him briefly, her expression clearer now, her choice made, and Marcus, still present near the front, remained watchful, his authority ready to act at the right moment. The hum of the engines carried on, but inside the cabin, something profound was unfolding. The unraveling of one facade had become the awakening of many eyes, and Jordan knew, as surely as the sun would rise beyond the horizon, that this was only the beginning. The seatbelt sign chimed softly above the cabin, its familiar glow signaling the beginning of descent. Passengers shifted in their seats, adjusting seat backs, tucking away loose belongings. On the surface, it was routine. But beneath the ordinary motions of preparing to land, the atmosphere in the business class cabin remained charged, as if everyone knew they were closing in on something far greater than just a runway. Jordan Miles sat with his notebook resting on his lap, its cover closed now but still warm with the weight of his words. He gazed out the window at the patchwork of clouds breaking open to reveal the glimmer of city lights below. The world was reappearing, and with it came the knowledge that the story unfolding in the air would not end upon landing. It would only begin anew. Carla Jensen stood stiffly at the front of the cabin, her composure eroded by the hours behind her. She avoided Jordan's gaze, her movements mechanical as she checked compartments and straightened small items along the aisle. Once, she had commanded authority here with the ease of experience. Now, her authority was cracked, reduced to mere motions performed under watchful eyes. Passengers noticed. Their whispers were softer now, but their glances lingered. A businessman in row 4 shook his head slightly as Carla passed. A woman near the window leaned into her partner, murmuring something about accountability. The cabin had turned against her, not through anger, but through a collective withdrawal of respect. Richard Cole remained in his seat, restless, his hands drumming against the armrest. His earlier bravado had drained into frustration. He muttered about delays, about order, about the state of things, but his words carried no audience. Even those who had once glanced in quiet agreement now ignored him. He was a man out of place, revealed for what he was when the light of courage had burned away shadows. Emily Torres moved quietly through the aisle, securing items, her presence steady. She no longer carried the timid hesitance of earlier hours. Each movement she made now seemed deliberate, infused with a quiet confidence. She had chosen her ground, and it showed. Passengers noticed her, too, the way they noticed Linda Park, who still sat calm and composed across from Jordan. Linda's presence remained a pillar in the cabin. She did not speak again, but she did not need to. Her single act of breaking the silence had already changed the air. Now, she simply sat with quiet dignity, a reminder that courage need not be loud to be powerful. Jordan leaned back slightly, closing his eyes for a moment. Inside him, the storm had settled into clarity. He had witnessed what he came for. He had seen prejudice, silence, complicity, courage, authority, and unraveling. Each piece formed a pattern he could not deny. Each piece confirmed what he had feared yet needed to witness with his own eyes. He breathed deeply, grounding himself for what lay ahead. The landing would bring more than the thud of wheels on tarmac. It would bring questions, meetings, consequences. It would bring decisions that could not be delayed any longer. He opened his eyes again and reached for his notebook. With steady handwriting, he began to outline the framework of change. Step 1. A full audit of service reports from the last 90 days. Step 2. Mandatory training for all frontline staff on fairness and respect. Step 3. The creation of an anonymous hotline to report bias or misconduct. Step 4. Immediate suspension of staff under investigation. Step 5. Recognition and reward for employees who choose integrity under pressure. The words filled the page quickly, clear and decisive. This was not a vague plan. It was an action map, a blueprint for transformation. As the aircraft dipped lower, turbulence nudged the cabin gently. Passengers clutched armrests or leaned into headrests. Jordan felt the vibration under his feet, steady but insistent. The descent was both physical and symbolic, carrying him toward a confrontation with his own people, his own company, his own responsibility. Captain Andrew Hayes's voice came over the intercom, calm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent into New York. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for landing. We'll be on the ground shortly." The announcement was routine, but its undertone was different. For those who had witnessed the events in the cabin, it carried an added weight. They were not only descending toward an airport, they were descending into accountability, into clarity, into truth. Jordan glanced once more across the aisle. Linda met his gaze again, offering a faint smile. Emily walked past, pausing just briefly to give him a look of quiet respect. Marcus Green remained near the front, calm and steady, his presence a silent assurance that the system was ready to act. Jordan allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The battle within him had eased. The urge to shout, to fight with words, had transformed into resolve to act with structure. That was the true power of leadership, not noise, but direction. The aircraft pierced through the final layer of clouds, the city glowing brighter below. Runways stretched out like illuminated paths waiting to catch the plane's descent. The hum of the engines deepened as the landing gear deployed with a thud. Jordan placed his notebook carefully into his leather bag, fastening it closed. His eyes never left the window as the ground approached, but his thoughts were already steps ahead. The temporary meeting room awaiting him, the executives who would sit around the table, the media waiting outside the terminal, and the thousands of employees whose lives and practices would be reshaped by what began here. The wheels touched down with a deep vibration, the cabin jolting slightly as the plane slowed. Applause rippled softly from a few passengers, the customary relief of landing. But beneath it, Jordan sensed something more. They were not just applauding a safe arrival. They were applauding endurance, composure, and perhaps even the quiet dignity of the man in 2B. The aircraft taxied toward the gate, its engines humming as if carrying the weight of what had transpired. Passengers unbuckled belts, gathered belongings, but their eyes continued to flicker toward Jordan, toward Linda, toward Emily, toward Marcus. They knew this flight had become something larger than them. Jordan sat upright, his bag at his side, his expression calm but resolute. He was no longer only a passenger. He was once again the leader, ready to step into the world outside and turn observation into action. The chime sounded once more, signaling the release of passengers. The door opened, and the crisp winter air of New York swept in. Jordan rose slowly, adjusting his jacket, each step deliberate as he moved toward the exit. He could feel the eyes on him, the unspoken acknowledgement of what he had endured and what he was about to do. The story had not ended in the air. It was only descending into its most important chapter. The cabin door swung open, and the rush of winter air from the jet bridge entered the aircraft. Passengers rose, pulling bags from overhead bins, adjusting coats, whispering their goodbyes. On the surface, it looked like the usual end of a cross-country flight. Yet every person in business class knew they were walking away from something they would never forget. Jordan Miles stood, his leather bag resting firmly on his shoulder. He moved unhurriedly toward the exit, acknowledging Emily Torres with a small nod as he passed. Her eyes glimmered, a mixture of relief and respect. Carla Jensen lingered near the galley, stiff and silent, her gaze fixed on the floor. Passengers brushed past her without acknowledgement, the weight of her earlier actions pressing like a shadow she could not escape. As Jordan stepped onto the jet bridge, Marcus Green was waiting. Flanked by 2 senior airport managers, Marcus carried the calm urgency of a man who knew the next hours would shape not only a story, but an institution. "This way," Marcus said quietly. Jordan followed without hesitation. They walked briskly through the terminal, away from the stream of passengers, toward a frosted glass conference room tucked behind the operations center. Waiting inside were a legal officer, a representative from Human Resources, and 2 directors from Corporate Compliance. Their faces carried both anticipation and unease. Jordan set his bag down at the head of the table. He did not wait for introductions. His voice, calm yet unyielding, filled the room. What happened today is not an isolated incident. It is a reflection of a deeper cultural issue inside our airline, and it ends now. The room was silent, every eye fixed on him. "I've received reports for months," Jordan continued, his tone steady. "Stories of passengers being questioned because of how they look, spoken to with less courtesy, treated as though they did not belong. I needed to see it myself. And today, I did. On Flight 482 Seat 2B, I was asked to leave my rightful place. A passenger felt entitled to humiliate me publicly, and the silence of others nearly allowed it to stand." He let the words hang. The silence was no longer avoidance, it was acknowledgement. "We are launching the SkyReach Integrity Protocol effective immediately," Jordan declared. "Here is what it will include: a full audit of service interactions from the past 90 days, mandatory fairness and respect training for every employee, from ticket agents to senior staff, an anonymous hotline for reporting misconduct, protected from retaliation, immediate suspension for personnel under investigation, and recognition for those who choose integrity, like the attendant who confirmed my ticket despite fear of consequence." Marcus took rapid notes. The legal officer nodded, already envisioning the steps required. HR scribbled furiously, though their hand trembled slightly with the weight of what was being set in motion. "Media is already asking questions," the HR representative said cautiously. "Do we release a statement tonight?" Jordan's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a sharper edge. "No one speaks until I do. This message must come from the highest level. It must not be a defensive apology. It must be a proactive commitment. When I speak, it will be clear, decisive, and leave no doubt about where we stand." The room stilled. His authority was absolute. But it was not arrogance, it was clarity. Within the hour, Jordan left the terminal, escorted by Marcus and the directors, into a waiting car. Outside, television vans crowded near the airport entrance, their cameras hungry. Inside the car, Jordan remained silent, his gaze fixed on the passing lights of the city. His notebook lay open on his lap, the 5 steps of reform clear and unwavering. The next morning, the lobby of SkyReach headquarters in Manhattan filled with reporters. Cameras crowded the entrance, lenses aimed at the podium set against a backdrop bearing the airline's new slogan, "Every passenger, every time." Jordan entered without flourish, dressed in a dark suit and gray tie, his expression calm. He stepped to the podium, placed both hands firmly on its edge, and looked directly into the cameras. "Yes," he began, his voice steady. "I was the passenger in seat 2B on Flight 482 yesterday. I was questioned, asked to leave my rightful seat, and subjected to public humiliation. But this is not only about me. It is about every person who has been judged at first glance, treated as though they did not belong, and left to carry that wound in silence." The room stilled. Every word struck like a chord. "Skyreach serves millions of passengers every year," Jordan continued, "and yet some of them have not received the respect they deserve. That ends today. We will not issue empty apologies. We will take action. The integrity protocol is in motion. We will audit our service culture, train every employee, open channels for truth, and hold accountable those who fail to honor dignity. Most importantly, we will commit that no matter your background, no matter your appearance, no matter your seat, you will be treated with absolute respect." He paused, letting the silence breathe. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised, cameras flashing. "This is my promise," Jordan concluded, "not only as the leader of this airline, but as a man who has lived this experience. We will do better. And we will begin now." He stepped away from the podium, ignoring shouted questions, blending into his team as cameras chased him down the hall. The speech, recorded in full, spread across networks within hours. Headlines filled digital feeds. "CEO confronts bias at 30,000 feet. Skyreach commits to reform. Every passenger, every time." Inside the airline, the ripple was immediate. Emails poured into HR, some in support, others recounting similar stories long kept silent. The anonymous hotline, launched that same morning, logged dozens of calls within its first hours. Training sessions were scheduled across the country. Managers summoned their teams. A cultural shift had been set in motion, unstoppable now that the highest voice had spoken. For Emily Torres, an email arrived from HR by midday. Her actions confirming Jordan's ticket, despite pressure, were recognized as an example of professional integrity. Jordan himself sent her a brief message. "Thank you for doing the right thing, even when it was not easy." For Carla Jensen, a suspension order arrived the same afternoon, pending full investigation. The story spread quickly among crew, a quiet warning that no word or gesture was too small to escape accountability. And for Richard Cole, his name surfaced across social media, passengers sharing what they had witnessed. By evening, his influence had eroded into public shame, his entitlement exposed for what it was, at home in his Manhattan office. Jordan sat with his leather notebook open once more. He crossed off the first steps of reform, satisfied but not complacent. He knew this was only the beginning. Cultural change was not built in a day, but it had to begin somewhere, and it had begun here, with one flight, one confrontation, one choice to sit firmly and not yield. He wrote the final line of the day in his notebook. "True strength is not measured by numbers or profit, but by how we treat people when the moment is small, when no cameras are watching. That is where the soul of an institution is revealed." Closing the notebook, Jordan leaned back in his chair, gazing out the window at the city alive with lights. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more challenges, more resistance, but tonight he allowed himself a quiet satisfaction. He had seen the truth with his own eyes, and he had acted. Skyreach Airways would never be the same. And so, from one quiet confrontation in the sky, a movement was born. Jordan Miles reminded us that strength isn't always in loud words or dramatic gestures. It is in the calm insistence on dignity, in the choice to stay seated when the world tells you to move. This story is not just about an airline. It is about all of us, about the moments when silence becomes complicity, and about the voices that finally break through. It is about the responsibility to treat every person with respect, no matter where they sit, how they look, or what others assume about them. Tonight, let us carry that lesson with us. Let us love a little deeper, respect a little more fiercely, and stand against the quiet cruelties that too often pass unnoticed. Because injustice thrives in silence, but justice begins with us. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe. Join us for the next journey, where together we'll uncover more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the power of humanity.